Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into something quite fascinating and honestly, for a lot of Nigerians, still a bit of a puzzle.
hmm
It's about former President Muhammadu Buhari and his, well, really surprising path to the presidency back in 2015.
Right, because this was someone who'd run before, 3 times, in fact.
Exactly, 3 times and lost each time. Often seen as perhaps unelectable by many due to certain perceptions, ethnic, religious biases that were often brought up.
Definitely. He was seen by some as, well, politically challenging, let's say.
But then, on his fourth try in 2015, he wins. And not just wins, but by a landslide. So the big question remains, what on earth happened? What changed?
That's the exact question we're exploring. And to help us unpack this, we're looking at a specific source today. It's an opinion piece from the National Accord newspaper.
Okay.
It dates back to February 17th, 2022. The title is quite provocative. In Denial of Truth, President Buhari and the Burden of Perfidy. It's written by Umar Ardo, Ph.D.
Burden of perfidy. Wow, okay. So our aim here, our sort of mission for this deep dive, is really to explore the viewpoint offered in this article by Dr. Ardo. What does he argue was the turning point for Buhari's political fortunes, especially leading up to that 2015 win?
Well, Ardo points to a very, very specific moment. He says the incipient seed, his words, of Buhari's 2015 victory was actually sown way back in April 2011.
April 2011, what was happening then?
That was right after Goodluck Jonathan was declared the winner of the presidential election that year, right after Buhari's third loss.
So immediately after that defeat.
Immediately. And what's really interesting, Ardo claims this isn't just his take on it. He says it's a fact known to himself, to Buhari, and just a handful of others.
Suggesting some kind of inside knowledge, a specific strategy being born right then.
It certainly implies that. A strategic shift right when things looked pretty bleak after that third defeat.
And Ardo positions himself right at the center of this shift, doesn't he? He makes a point that while others maybe backed away from Buhari then, he actually stepped closer.
He does. He really emphasizes that. Claims he offered his skills, his services, completely free of charge, pro bono, to help Buhari's political cause.
At a time when presumably many might have been trying to align with the winner, Jonathan.
Exactly. He paints himself as this loyal supporter stepping up when Buhari was, probably quite down after another loss.
And he claims it wasn't just general support. He details some really specific, very significant contributions he says he made.
Oh, absolutely. He claims he provided the actual idea, the core concept that turned Buhari's political misfortunes around.
The key idea. And he says Buhari took it on board quickly.
Remarkably quickly, according to Ardo.
Yeah.
He claims Buhari accepted this idea within just 3 hours of hearing it.
3 hours. That's incredibly fast for such a potentially game-changing thing, if it's true, of course.
It really is. It sounds almost too quick, perhaps. But that's his claim, a pivotal moment.
Does he say what the idea was?
No, the article doesn't actually detail the specifics of the idea itself, which is maybe a bit frustrating for us digging into it.
Yeah. A key piece missing then.
It is. But Ardo does say he didn't just come up with the idea. He claims he then drew up the whole plan for it.
Okay, so the strategy document as well.
Right, and then brought in key people, contacts, to help make it happen. He even says he was responsible for sourcing the funds needed to organize things and drive this new plan forward.
Wow. So he's positioning himself not just as the ideas guy, but the strategist, the networker, and the fundraiser, essentially.
Pretty much the whole package, based on his account, covering all the bases in that critical period after 2011.
He also makes another big claim that he had to convince Buhari to even run again.
Yes. He says Buhari had publicly stated he wouldn't contest again after the 2011 loss.
I think I remember that, actually, a sense that maybe he was done with running.
Right. And Ardo describes this despondent moment where he apparently stepped in, offered hope, and persuaded him to go for it a fourth time.
And then worked with him closely.
For about 3 years, Ardo says, a long period of close collaboration.
What did that look like, according to him?
Well, he mentions having consistent access, regular phone calls, meetings. He says Buhari even introduced him to his close confidants, family members, to make sure everyone was working together on this plan.
So really integrating him into the inner circle.
Deeply integrated, it seems. Ardo even claims that during this specific period, Buhari himself publicly called him his most trusted political ally.
Most trusted political ally. That's a very strong statement. if true, it paints a picture of incredible closeness and reliance.
It really does. A deep level of trust and collaboration, you'd assume.
Which makes what Ardo says happen next even more surprising, or jarring, perhaps.
Exactly. Because he then describes being completely shut out, just cut off, right after Buhari won in 2015.
Shut out? How so?
And claims he couldn't even get a meeting to congratulate Buhari in person. From the moment Buhari was declared president-elect, Ardo says the door was closed.
No contact at all after being the most trusted ally.
That's the narrative, a total freeze-out. And Ardo expresses, complete bewilderment in the article. Why this sudden rejection after years of supposedly vital work?
Did he try to reach out?
Oh, yes. He details his efforts, says he wrote 3 letters directly to Buhari. No response, apparently. Then he tried going through intermediaries, people he knew were close to Buhari.
Who did he mention?
He mentions meeting with the Attorney General, someone Ardo says Buhari had actually introduced him to earlier.
Okay, so a known connection.
Right. Also, the Minister of State for Petroleum, someone Ardo claims he introduced to Buhari.
Interesting twist there.
And Buhari's brother-in-law, apparently the first person Buhari introduced Ardo to in that inner circle. And even twice with Buhari's chief of staff, someone Ardo says he considers like an elder brother.
So he went through multiple, seemingly well-connected channels.
Channels established during that period of close collaboration.
And still couldn't get an audience.
Apparently not. Which really reinforces his feeling of being deliberately sidelined, perhaps even intentionally forgotten.
Which brings us back to that title, Denial of Truth and Burden of Perfidy. How does Ardo interpret this silence, this avoidance?
Well, his conclusion is pretty stark. He believes Buhari's refusal to see him is basically a refusal to acknowledge the truth.
The truth being Ardo's contribution.
Precisely. Ardo's input, his idea, his plan, the whole foundation he claims he laid for that successful 4th run. He thinks Buhari is avoiding him because facing him means facing that truth.
He even uses the word afraid, doesn't he? That Buhari might be afraid of this truth.
He does, which is a strong accusation. And that word perfidy, it clearly signals a feeling of deep betrayal.
Betrayal of trust, specifically, given their supposed closeness.
Yeah, exactly. Betrayal of that most trusted political ally status. Ardo even brings up Buhari's old slogan, or hailing phrase, as he calls it.
Oh, the Semai Gaskia one.
That's the one. Meaning, roughly, the truth is the best in Hausa. Ardo says that phrase basically became a fallacy in his own case. A bit pointed that.
Very pointed. It implies a hypocrisy, almost.
It does carry that implication. Now, it's important to add, Ardo does acknowledge that, winning an election is a huge effort. Many people contributed to Buhari's victory.
He's not claiming he did it single-handedly.
No, he's careful to say that. But he insists his own role was, quote, uniquely different. He sees himself as the one who started it all, the initiator of the foundation.
The seed planter, going back to his earlier metaphor.
Right. And he mentions an interesting, maybe slightly chilling exchange with Buhari's Minister of State Petroleum.
The one he supposedly introduced to Buhari?
Yes. Apparently, this minister told Ardo something like, you cannot reverse the hand of the clock. Basically, what's done is done, move on.
Ouch.
Yeah. And Ardo's response, included in the article, is quite telling. He says, well, while you can't turn back time, the future is uncertain, and one should always try to repay good with good.
Suggesting a debt, a moral obligation, perhaps, that wasn't met?
That's certainly the strong undercurrent there. A feeling of ingratitude, of good deed left unreciprocated.
So how does Ardo wrap all this up in his piece? What's his final takeaway?
It's quite personal, actually. He concludes with a reflection on what he learned from the whole experience. Essentially, a lesson in being more careful, more circumspect about trusting people and relationships, no matter how close they seem.
A bit of a somber note to end on.
It is a personal lesson drawn from a major political event.
Okay, so let's try and summarize the core argument from Umar Ardo's perspective, as laid out in that National Accord piece.
Right. Essentially, Ardo argues that the real key, the secret ingredient to Buhari's surprising 2015 victory, was a strategic plan.
A plan conceived and initiated by Ardo himself.
Yes, right after the 2011 loss. He claims he worked closely with Buhari for years, providing the idea, the plan, the contacts, the funds, becoming his most trusted ally.
And then after the victory, he alleges he was completely shut out.
Which he interprets as Buhari deliberately denying the truth, refusing to acknowledge Ardo's absolutely pivotal, foundational role in that success, a perfidy, a betrayal of trust.
So this deep dive into Ardo's account really brings us right back where we started. Was this the secret? Was this behind-the-scenes maneuvering and subsequent alleged rejection the real story behind Buhari's turnaround?
Or, were other factors more significant? The political climate changing, alliances shifting, campaign messaging. Ardo presents one very specific, very personal narrative.
It's definitely a compelling one, though, isn't it? Whether you fully accept it or remain skeptical, it highlights just how complex these political victories can be.
Absolutely. It reminds us that beyond the headlines and the rallies, there are these intricate personal stories, alleged promises, and maybe even betrayals that can shape the course of history.
It certainly gives you, the listener, something to think about. How much of political success is strategy? How much is timing? How much is personality? And how much relies on these kinds of behind-the-scenes contributions that might or might not ever be fully acknowledged?
A reminder that the official story isn't always the whole story. There are often narratives, like Ardo's, simmering just beneath the surface.